The horses screamed through the darkness, their hooves pounding like thunder across the Alabama plantation as lightning split the sky above them. Elias Brown stood in the open doorway of the stable, rain pouring down his face, watching the animals he had cared for all his life charge toward the master's house in a wild stampede. His back still burned from the whip marks that had been carved into his flesh just hours before, but his eyes held no fear, only a strange calm as he watched what he had set in motion. By dawn, Charles Hightower would be found face down in the mud, his body broken beneath the hoofprints that scarred the earth like accusations written in the soil itself. And Elias, the quiet stable hand who had never raised his voice or his fist, would be gone, vanished into the stormy night as if he had never existed at all. But this moment, this terrible and beautiful moment of unleashed fury, was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the cotton fields of Wilcox County for generations to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Elias Brown begins not with that stormy night in 1853, but 11 years earlier when he was just a boy of 14 standing on an auction block in Montgomery, his wrists bound with rough hemp that bit into his skin. The summer heat pressed down on the crowded square where men and women with dark skin stood in various states of despair, while white buyers circled them like wolves evaluating prey. Elias had been born on a smaller farm near Selma, but when his first owner died, the estate was liquidated and all property, including human property, was sold to settle debts. He remembered his mother's face that morning, tears streaming down her cheeks as she was led in one direction while he was pulled in another. And he remembered making himself a promise that he would survive whatever came next, that he would find a way to endure until he could somehow find her again. Charles Hightower had purchased him for $800, a significant sum that reflected Elias's youth and apparent health. Hightower owned 3,000 acres of cotton land in Wilcox County, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people who lived in rows of rough cabins behind the main house. The plantation, known as Hightower Fields, was one of the most profitable operations in the region, and Charles Hightower was known among his peers as a shrewd businessman who squeezed every ounce of productivity from his land and his laborers. He was a tall man with gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked upon, and he had built his wealth through ruthless efficiency and an absolute refusal to tolerate what he called insubordination. Elias was assigned to work in the stables, a position that was considered somewhat privileged compared to the backbreaking labor in the cotton fields. Hightower owned 12 horses, magnificent animals that he used for riding, racing, and breeding. He was proud of his horses, often boasting to visitors that his breeding program produced some of the finest stock in Alabama. The head groom was an older man named Jupiter, who had been working with horses for 40 years and who took young Elias under his guidance with a mixture of sternness and unexpected kindness. Jupiter taught him how to read the temperament of each horse, how to approach them without causing alarm, how to check their legs for injuries, how to prepare feed that would keep them healthy and strong. Over the years, Elias developed a deep connection with the animals in his care. He learned their individual personalities, their quirks and preferences, the way each one responded differently to his voice and touch. There was Midnight, a black stallion with a white star on his forehead who was spirited but gentle once he trusted you. There was Lady, a chestnut mare who nuzzled his hand looking for the pieces of apple he often saved for her from the kitchen scraps. There was Thunder, a gray gelding who was Charles Hightower's favorite riding horse, powerful and fast with an intelligence that showed in his dark eyes. Elias spent more time with these horses than he did with most people, and in their presence he found moments of peace that were rare in his life of bondage. The work was hard, but it suited him. He rose before dawn each morning to feed and water the horses, mucked out the stalls, groomed their coats until they shone, exercised them in the paddock, and tended to any injuries or ailments under Jupiter's watchful instruction. He learned to braid manes and tails for shows, to saddle and bridle with precision, to recognize the early signs of colic or lameness. Jupiter often told him that he had a gift, that the horses responded to him in ways they did not respond to others. And Elias took pride in this, even though he knew that any skill he developed only increased his value as property, rather than bringing him closer to freedom. Life on Hightower fields followed brutal rhythms dictated by the seasons and the demands of cotton cultivation. In the spring, the fields were plowed and planted, the enslaved workers moving in long rows under the burning sun. In the summer, the cotton grew tall and required constant weeding and tending. In the fall came the harvest, when every able body was required to pick cotton from dawn until dark, filling sacks that grew heavy on their shoulders while overseers watched for any sign of slowing. In the winter there was repair work, preparation for the next planting, and no real rest because there was always something that needed doing on a plantation of this size. Charles Hightower ruled his domain with an iron will. He employed 3 overseers who carried whips and were authorized to use them freely to maintain what they called discipline. Punishments were public and brutal, meant to serve as warnings to anyone who might consider resistance. Elias had witnessed whippings, had seen people locked in the stocks for days with no shade from the sun, had heard the screams coming from the punishment shed where the most severe corrections were administered. He had learned to keep his head down, to speak only when spoken to never meet a white person's eyes directly, to move through his days with a careful invisibility that might protect him from notice and therefore from harm. But invisibility was not the same as numbness, and silence was not the same as acceptance. Inside himself, Elias carried a flame of rage that never went out, fed by every indignity and injustice he witnessed. He thought often of his mother, wondered if she was still alive somewhere, picking cotton in fields he would never see. He thought about the fundamental wrongness of a world where human beings could be bought and sold like livestock, where children could be torn from their parents, where a man's entire existence could be reduced to his monetary value. He kept these thoughts locked away in the deepest parts of himself because to speak them aloud would mean death. But they burned there nonetheless, a constant smoldering that waited for oxygen to burst into flame. Jupiter died in the winter of 1851, his heart giving out one cold morning as he carried water buckets to the stable. Elias found him collapsed in the dirt and held the old man's hand as he drew his last breaths, and something shifted in him that day. Jupiter had been like a father to him, had taught him everything he knew about horses, had shown him small kindnesses in a world that offered few. At the funeral, such as it was, a gathering of enslaved workers in the cemetery behind the cabins, Elias stood silent while someone spoke words over the grave, and he felt the weight of grief mixing with the weight of rage in his chest until he could barely breathe. After Jupiter's death, Elias became the head groom, though he was only 23 years old. Charles Hightower did not hire anyone to replace Jupiter, simply expected Elias to assume all the responsibilities himself. The work became heavier, the days longer, but Elias performed his duties with the same careful competence he had always shown. He cared for the horses as if they were his own, because in many ways they were the only living things in his world that he could protect and nurture. They depended on him, and he would not fail them even if everything else in his life was failure and loss. The summer of 1853 was particularly brutal, with temperatures climbing above 100 degrees day after day and very little rain. The cotton suffered, and Charles Hightower's temper grew shorter as he watched his profits threatened by the weather. He pushed the field workers harder, demanded longer hours, reduced rations to save money. People began to collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration. A young woman named Sarah died after working 16 hours straight in the sun, and her body was buried with little ceremony in the cemetery that held Jupiter, and so many others whose lives had been consumed by this place. In August, one of the horses, a bay mare named Grace, fell ill. Elias noticed she was off her feed and seemed lethargic, and he examined her carefully, checking for fever, looking at her gums, listening to her gut sounds. He suspected colic, a serious condition in horses that could quickly become fatal. He walked her slowly around the paddock to keep her intestines moving, gave her small amounts of water, watched her through the night. But despite his efforts, Grace's condition worsened. She began to thrash in pain, her eyes rolling white with distress, and Elias knew she was in serious trouble. He went to the main house at dawn to report Grace's condition to Charles Hightower, knowing that the master would want to be informed about any threat to his valuable breeding stock. Hightower came to the stable still in his night clothes, his face flushed with anger at being disturbed so early. He looked at the suffering mare and immediately blamed Elias, accusing him of negligence, of not noticing the problem sooner, of feeding her improperly. Elias tried to explain what he had done to help her, tried to describe the symptoms and his response, but Hightower was not interested in explanations. He saw only a valuable horse in distress and someone to blame for it. Grace died that afternoon despite everything Elias tried to do for her. He stayed with her until the end, stroking her neck and speaking softly to her as she struggled for breath. And when she finally went still, he felt tears running down his face for this beautiful creature who had done nothing to deserve such suffering. He had grown fond of all the horses, but Grace had been special, gentle, and sweet-tempered, and her loss hit him hard. Charles Hightower came to the stable that evening with two of his overseers, and Elias knew immediately that something terrible was about to happen. Hightower's face was twisted with rage, and he carried a riding crop in his hand, slapping it against his palm as he walked. He began shouting at Elias, accusing him of killing Grace through incompetence and negligence, calling him worthless and stupid, working himself into a fury that needed an outlet. Elias tried to defend himself, tried to explain that he had done everything possible, but his words only seemed to make Hightower angrier. The beating that followed was the worst Elias had ever endured. Hightower ordered him stripped to the waist and tied to a post in the stable yard, and then he took a whip, not the riding crop but a proper bullwhip, and began to lay into Elias's back with methodical violence. Each strike felt like fire across his skin, and Elias bit down on a leather strap they had given him to keep from screaming, determined not to give Hightower the satisfaction of hearing his pain. The other enslaved workers were forced to watch, gathered in a silent crowd that bore witness to this public demonstration of power and cruelty. After 20 lashes, Elias's back was a mass of torn flesh, blood running down to soak the waistband of his trousers. Hightower was breathing hard from the exertion, his arm tired, but he was not finished. He began to speak between strikes, telling Elias that he was nothing, that he was property, that his only value lay in his usefulness, and that if he could not even keep a horse alive, then perhaps he had no value at all. He threatened to sell Elias south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the work was even more brutal and the life expectancy measured in years rather than decades. He promised that if Elias ever failed him again, the punishment would be even worse. When it was finally over, they cut Elias down and he collapsed to the ground, barely conscious. 2 other workers carried him back to his cabin, a small, rough structure he shared with 3 other men. They laid him face down on his pallet and tried to clean his wounds with water and rags, but the damage was severe. His back looked like raw meat, the skin flayed open in long parallel lines, and everyone knew that these wounds would leave permanent scars, a map of suffering carved into his flesh. That night, Elias lay awake in the darkness, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. He could not lie on his back, could barely breathe without pain, and his mind was filled with a clarity that felt almost like madness. He understood in a way he had not fully grasped before that his life would never be his own, that no amount of good work or careful behavior would protect him from the casual cruelty of men like Charles Hightower, that he could be beaten or killed on a whim and no one would care or remember. He thought about Grace, about Jupiter, about his mother lost somewhere in the vast machinery of slavery, about all the people who had suffered and died in this place. And he felt something break inside himself, some last barrier between the careful, obedient person he had trained himself to be and the rage that had been building for 11 years. He knew he could not continue like this. Something had to change, even if that change meant his own death, because a life of endless suffering and degradation was not really life at all. He began to think about escape, about running north toward freedom, but he knew that escapes almost always failed. The dogs would track him, the patrollers would catch him, and the punishment for trying to run was often death. Or if Hightower was feeling merciful, the loss of a foot or hand to ensure he never tried again. Escape seemed impossible, a fantasy that would only lead to worse suffering. But there was another possibility, one that had been forming in the back of his mind as he lay there in the darkness listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. He knew Hightower's habits, knew that the man often walked out to the stable late at night to check on his horses, especially when one of them was pregnant or recovering from illness. He knew the layout of the property, knew where the overseers slept, knew the patterns of the watch that was kept each night. And he knew the horses, knew exactly how they would respond if someone opened their stall doors and drove them out into the night in a panic. The storm began building that afternoon, dark clouds rolling in from the west and the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the horses grew restless in their stalls, sensing the approaching weather. Elias went about his duties as if nothing was different, though his back screamed with pain at every movement. He fed the horses, checked their water, spoke to them softly as he always did. But his mind was working through the plan that had formed during his sleepless night, considering every detail, looking for flaws, accepting that he was probably going to die but feeling strangely calm about that possibility. As evening fell, the storm arrived in full force. Rain began to pour from the sky in sheets, and lightning cracked overhead with deafening booms that shook the stable walls. The horses whinnied nervously, moving in their stalls, and Elias moved among them, outwardly trying to calm them but inwardly preparing for what he was about to do. He had seen Charles Hightower walking toward the main house after dinner, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the man came out to check on the horses, because that was what Hightower always did during storms, unable to resist the urge to verify that his valuable property was secure. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled around the stable, driving rain through every crack and gap in the walls, and the thunder was a constant drumming that seemed to shake the earth itself. Elias stood in the center of the stable, water dripping from his hair and clothes, and he made his decision. He began opening the stall doors, moving quickly from one to the next, swinging each door wide and latching it back against the wall. The horses looked at him with confusion at first, unsure why their safe enclosures were suddenly open, but they did not immediately leave their stalls. Elias knew he needed to drive them out, to create a stampede that would serve his purpose. He had never hurt these animals, had spent years caring for them with gentleness and patience. But now he needed them to run, needed them to panic and flee into the storm. He picked up a length of rope and began cracking it like a whip, making sharp, snapping sounds that echoed through the stable. He shouted at the horses, something he had never done before, his voice harsh and commanding. He waved his arms, made himself large and threatening, moving toward them with aggressive energy. The horses responded as he knew they would. Midnight bolted first, charging out of his stall and through the stable doors into the storm. Lady followed, then Thunder, then all the others in a cascade of pounding hooves and frightened whinnies. They burst out into the night, running blindly in the rain and lightning, and Elias ran with them, directing them toward the main house with shouts and waves of his arms. He could see their dark shapes moving through the storm, could hear the thunder of their hooves mixing with the thunder from the sky, and he felt a wild exhilaration mixed with his rage and pain. The horses stampeded across the grounds toward the main house, driven by fear and confusion. Elias saw a figure emerge from the house, saw Charles Hightower coming down the front steps with a lantern in his hand, drawn by the sound of the horses. Hightower stood there in the storm, his lantern a small circle of light in the darkness, and he began shouting commands, trying to turn the horses away, trying to regain control of the situation. But the horses were beyond control now, running in blind panic, and Elias watched as they closed the distance between themselves and the man who owned them. What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. Hightower tried to step back, tried to retreat to the safety of the house, but the ground was slick with mud and his foot slipped. He went down hard, the lantern flying from his hand and extinguishing in the rain. And suddenly he was on the ground directly in the path of the stampeding horses. Elias stood frozen, watching from a distance as Thunder, the lead horse, tried to swerve around the fallen man but could not change direction fast enough on the treacherous ground. The horse's hoof came down on Hightower's chest, and then the others were upon him, unable to stop their momentum, their hooves striking the man who had been their master. The whole thing lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then the horses were past, running on into the night, disappearing into the fields beyond the house. Elias stood in the rain, breathing hard, watching the still form lying in the mud. He waited for movement, for any sign that Hightower had survived, but there was none. The plantation owner lay motionless, his body broken by the very animals he had valued above human lives. Elias knew he had only moments before someone else came out of the house to investigate the commotion. He could see lights appearing in windows, could hear voices calling out. He turned and ran, not back toward the slave quarters where he would be trapped, but out toward the fields, toward the woods that lay beyond the cultivated land. His back burned with fresh pain as he ran, the wounds tearing open again with his exertion, but he ignored the pain, focused only on putting distance between himself and the plantation. He ran through rows of cotton plants, the stalks whipping against his legs, and then he reached the tree line and plunged into the woods. The storm continued around him, rain pouring through the canopy, lightning occasionally illuminating the forest in stark flashes. He had no plan beyond escape, no map or supplies, only the desperate need to be away from Hightower Fields, away from the place where he had spent 11 years in bondage. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion, and then he kept running, driven by fear and fury and something that might have been freedom or might have been just another form of cage. Hours later, when the storm finally began to subside, Elias found himself deep in the woods, lost and alone. He collapsed against a tree, his clothes soaked through, his body shaking with cold and shock and pain. He had no idea where he was or where he was going. He knew that by now they had found Hightower's body, knew that they would be organizing search parties, knew that dogs would be brought in to track his scent. He had left prints in the mud, had left traces of blood from his torn back, had left a trail that anyone could follow. But for now, in this moment, he was beyond their reach. He sat there in the darkness, listening to the rain dripping from the trees and the distant sound of thunder moving away to the east, and he allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years, a sense of his own agency, his own power to shape his circumstances even if that shaping led to his destruction. He had acted rather than endured, had struck back rather than submitted, and whatever happened next, he would face it knowing that he had refused to accept the life they had tried to impose on him. As dawn approached, Elias forced himself to move again. He followed the sound of running water and found a creek, and he waded into it, knowing that the water would help hide his scent from the dogs. He moved downstream, his feet numb from the cold, his back a mass of agony, but his mind surprisingly clear. He had heard stories from other enslaved people about the Underground Railroad, about routes north to freedom, about safe houses where people would hide runaways and help them reach free states. He did not know if these stories were true or if they were just hopeful fantasies, but they were all he had now. So he would move north, would keep going until he found safety or until they caught him. Whichever came first. The search for Elias began at first light. Charles Hightower's body was discovered in the mud, trampled by the horses that had been his pride, and the overseers immediately concluded that this was not an accident. The stable doors had all been opened, the horses scattered across the property, and Elias was nowhere to be found. They put the story together quickly. The slave had deliberately driven the horses in a stampede, had caused his master's death, and had fled. This was not just an escape. It was murder, or something close enough to murder that it demanded the most severe response. Patrollers were summoned from neighboring plantations, men with dogs and guns who specialized in hunting runaway slaves. They found Elias's tracks leading away from the stable toward the fields, found spots of blood that marked his passage, found the place where he had entered the woods. The dogs picked up his scent and began to bay, pulling their handlers forward, and the hunt began in earnest. These men were experienced trackers, and they were motivated by both professional pride and genuine outrage at what they saw as an unforgivable act of rebellion. If Elias was caught, he would be killed, probably hanged as an example to every other enslaved person in the county, and his body would be left on display as a warning. But Elias had learned much in his years of careful observation, had paid attention to things that seemed unimportant at the time, but now proved valuable. He knew how to move quietly through woods, had spent time hunting small game to supplement his meager rations, and understood how to cover his tracks. He stayed in the creek for miles, knowing it would break his trail, and when he finally climbed out, he did so on rocky ground that would not hold prints. He moved during the day when the search parties would expect him to hide, and he rested at night in concealed spots where he could hear anyone approaching. He ate berries and roots that he knew were safe, drank from streams, pushed his body past exhaustion because stopping meant capture and capture meant death. Days passed, and the search continued but found nothing. The dogs lost his scent at the creek and could not pick it up again. The patrollers searched in widening circles, checked known hiding spots, questioned every enslaved person on every nearby plantation, but Elias had vanished. Some of the searchers began to believe he must have died in the woods, that his wounds had become infected, or that he had succumbed to exposure or starvation. Others insisted he must still be out there, moving through the countryside like a ghost, surviving through some combination of luck and skill. Back at Hightower Fields, the story of what had happened began to take on mythical qualities. People whispered that Elias had possessed some kind of power over the horses, that he had commanded them to kill his master through force of will alone. They said that on the night of the storm, some had seen a lone rider on horseback, a silhouette against the lightning guiding the stampeding horses with supernatural skill. They said that Elias had not fled on foot but had ridden away on thunder, the gray gelding, disappearing into the storm like a spirit returning to whatever realm had spawned him. None of these stories were true, but truth mattered less than narrative in a world where enslaved people had so little power that any story of successful resistance became precious, worth preserving and embellishing and passing on. The story of Elias Brown, who had unleashed the horses and vanished into the stormy night, became a kind of legend, spoken in quiet voices in slave quarters across Alabama. A story about a man who had refused to accept his bondage, who had struck back against his oppressor, and who had disappeared into freedom or death or whatever lay beyond the reach of those who claimed ownership of human souls. The truth was at once more mundane and more remarkable. Elias did survive those first desperate days in the woods. He moved steadily north, guided by the stars and by vague directions he had heard from others who had attempted escape. He avoided roads and towns, lived like an animal in the wilderness, and somehow, through a combination of luck and determination, he managed to keep ahead of the search parties. His wounds began to heal, though they would scar him for life, and he grew thin and hard from his ordeal, barely recognizable as the person he had been. After 2 weeks, Elias encountered his first piece of genuine luck. He was hiding in a grove of trees near a small farm, watching the house to see if there might be an opportunity to steal some food, when an older black woman came walking toward his hiding place carrying a basket. She walked directly to where he was concealed, showing no surprise at finding him there, and she set down the basket, which contained bread, cheese, and a jug of water. She spoke quietly, telling him that this was a safe place, that the family who owned the farm were Quakers who opposed slavery and helped runaways when they could. This was Elias's introduction to the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and sympathetic people who guided escaped slaves toward freedom in the North. The woman's name was Rachel, and she herself had escaped from slavery 20 years earlier and had been helping others ever since. She brought Elias to the farm after dark, where he was hidden in a false cellar beneath the barn, and for 3 days he rested there, eating real food and regaining some of his strength while Rachel made arrangements for the next leg of his journey. He learned that he was in northern Alabama, about 40 miles from where he had started, and that he had a long way yet to go. The nearest free state was Ohio, hundreds of miles to the north, and between him and freedom lay a landscape filled with people who would return him to slavery if given the chance. But the Underground Railroad would help him, passing him from one safe house to the next, hiding him in wagons and cellars and attics, moving him steadily northward under cover of darkness. The journey took months. Elias traveled mostly at night, guided by conductors who knew the routes and the dangers. He hid in the homes of abolitionists, both black and white, people who risked their own freedom and safety to help him. He traveled through Tennessee and Kentucky, crossed the Ohio River on a foggy night in a small boat, and finally reached free soil in the autumn of 1853. When he set foot in Ohio, knowing that he was legally free, he fell to his knees and wept, overwhelmed by emotions too complex to name. But freedom, he discovered, was not the same as safety, and it was certainly not the same as home. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that he could be captured even in free states and returned to slavery. He had no papers, no identity beyond his own word, no skills that translated easily to paid employment in an economy he did not understand. He was illiterate, traumatized, scarred physically and psychologically by his years in bondage. The Underground Railroad helped him settle in a small community of formerly enslaved people in Ohio, where he found work as a stable hand again, because horses were what he knew and trusted. Elias lived in Ohio for the rest of his life, which was considerably shorter than it should have been. The damage to his back from the beating never fully healed, and he suffered from chronic pain and periodic infections. He never married, never had children, kept largely to himself in a small cabin on the edge of town. He worked with horses until his body would no longer permit it, and then he did odd jobs, anything that would earn him enough to eat and keep a roof over his head. He died in 1867 at the age of 38, his body worn out from hardship and suffering, and he was buried in a cemetery for black residents, where his grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that bore his name. The story might have ended there, with Elias as just another casualty of the slavery system, one more person whose life was stolen and whose potential was never realized. But the legend that had grown up around him in Alabama did not die. It was passed down through generations, transformed and embellished but retaining its essential core. A man named Elias Brown, who had cared for horses on a plantation, who had been beaten by his master, and who had on one stormy night opened the stable doors and driven those horses into a stampede that killed Charles Hightower, vanishing afterward into the night as if he had never existed. In Wilcox County, people said that on stormy nights you could sometimes see a lone rider on a gray horse galloping across the fields where Hightower Plantation once stood. They said it was the ghost of Elias Brown, still running, still refusing to be captured or contained. Children heard the story and imagined themselves as brave as Elias, defying impossible odds, choosing freedom even at the cost of everything. Former slaves who had survived to see Emancipation told the story to their grandchildren, using it to illustrate the courage of those who had resisted, who had fought back in whatever ways they could, who had refused to accept the chains that others tried to place upon them. The historical record preserves only fragments of the truth. Court documents from Wilcox County in 1853 mention the death of Charles Hightower, described as a tragic accident involving horses during a storm. They note that a slave named Elias absconded around the same time, and that despite extensive searches he was never apprehended. No mention is made of any connection between these events because to acknowledge such a connection would be to admit that enslaved people could successfully resist and escape, and such admissions were dangerous to a system that depended on the myth of total control. Hightower Fields continued to operate after Charles Hightower's death, inherited by his son William, who proved even more brutal than his father. The plantation survived the Civil War, though it was badly damaged during Sherman's campaign through Alabama, and it limped along through Reconstruction before finally being broken up and sold in parcels during the economic depressions of the late 1800s. The main house burned down in 1906, and by the middle of the 20th century, there was little left to mark the place where so much suffering had occurred. The land was absorbed into larger agricultural operations. The slave quarters were demolished or collapsed into ruin, and the only remnants were a few foundation stones in the cemetery where Jupiter and so many others lay buried in unmarked graves. But memory persists in ways that physical structures do not. The story of Elias Brown was preserved in oral tradition, passed down through families, recorded eventually by historians interested in documenting the experiences of enslaved people and their resistance to bondage. In the 1930s, during the Federal Writers Project, interviewers spoke with elderly formerly enslaved people, and several of them mentioned Elias, though they were children when the events occurred and remembered only fragments, pieces of a story they had heard from their parents and grandparents. One woman, aged 94, when interviewed, said she remembered the night of the storm, remembered hearing the horses screaming and the sound of their hooves, remembered the fear that ran through the slave quarters when they learned that Master Hightower was dead and Elias was gone. She said people talked about it in whispers for years, said it gave them hope that resistance was possible even when it seemed impossible. Modern historians examining the case have tried to separate fact from legend. They acknowledge that Charles Hightower did die in 1853 in an incident involving horses during a storm, and that an enslaved man named Elias Brown did disappear around the same time and was never captured. They note that several formerly enslaved people reported seeing or hearing about this incident, though their accounts vary in details. Some historians argue that Hightower's death was likely a genuine accident, that Elias's disappearance was coincidental, and that the story of deliberate revenge was a legend constructed after the fact to serve psychological needs within the enslaved community. Other historians disagree, pointing out that enslaved people had extensive knowledge of their master's habits and property. that acts of resistance and sabotage were far more common than written records acknowledge because enslavers had strong incentives to suppress such information, and that dismissing these stories as legend often reflects bias rather than evidence. They note that Elias had expertise with horses and would have known exactly how they would respond if frightened and released during a storm. They note that he disappeared immediately after Hightower's death, suggesting premeditation rather than coincidence. They argue that the absence of documentary evidence proving intent does not prove absence of intent, especially in a system where enslavers controlled the creation of records and had every reason to portray slave resistance as rare and ineffective. What remains indisputable is that Elias Brown refused to remain enslaved, that he escaped and was never recaptured, and that his story became meaningful to generations of Black Americans as an example of resistance and courage. Whether he deliberately caused Charles Hightower's death or simply took advantage of a fortunate accident, he made a choice to flee toward freedom, and he succeeded where so many others failed. In a system designed to deny enslaved people any agency over their own lives, this success itself was revolutionary. The larger story of American slavery contains thousands of stories like Elias's, stories of people who resisted in ways large and small, who refused to be broken by a system designed to break them, who maintained their humanity in circumstances that denied their very personhood. Some resistance was dramatic and violent, like the rebellion led by Nat Turner in Virginia or the uprising on the slave ship Amistad. Some was subtle and persistent, like work slowdowns, tool breaking, feigning illness, or the preservation of African cultural traditions despite attempts to erase them. Some was individual and desperate, like Elias's decision to open those stable doors and drive the horses into the storm. Each act of resistance, whether successful or not, was an assertion of selfhood against a system that sought to reduce human beings to property. Each escape attempt, whether it ended in freedom or recapture or death, was a declaration that the condition of slavery was intolerable and that freedom was worth any risk. And each story that survived, passed down through oral tradition or preserved in fragmentary documents, served as testimony to the unbreakable human spirit, the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable or permanent. In Elias's case, the story took on particular power because of its dramatic elements. The storm, the horses, the death of the master, the vanishing into the night. These elements made it memorable, made it the kind of story that people wanted to tell and retell, each telling adding new details or interpretations. Some versions emphasized Elias's skill with horses, suggesting he had trained them to respond to his commands and had called them to him during the stampede. Other versions focused on divine intervention, suggesting that God had sent the storm to aid Elias's escape and had guided the horses as instruments of justice. Still others portrayed Elias as a kind of folk hero, a trickster figure who had outsmarted his oppressors through cunning and courage. What all these versions shared was a recognition that Elias had done something extraordinary, that he had broken the rules of a system designed to be unbreakable, and that his actions had consequences that rippled far beyond his own individual fate. Charles Hightower's death sent shockwaves through the planter class of Wilcox County and surrounding areas. If an enslaved person could kill their master and escape successfully, what did that mean for the security of the entire system? The response was predictably harsh: increased patrols, stricter controls, more brutal punishments for any hint of insubordination. But the response itself revealed the fear that lay beneath the surface of white supremacy, the knowledge that the system depended on violence and intimidation because it could not survive on consent or legitimacy. For enslaved people throughout the region, Elias's story offered something different, a glimpse of possibility, a reminder that the system was not invincible, that individual action could matter. The story spread through the informal networks of communication that existed among enslaved communities, carried by hired-out workers who moved between plantations, by preachers who held secret religious services, by families visiting across property lines on rare days off. Each person who heard the story interpreted it through their own experiences and hopes, finding in it whatever they needed: inspiration, comfort, a model for their own potential resistance, or simply a moment of satisfaction in imagining a master getting what he deserved. The story also reached free black communities in the North through the networks of the Underground Railroad. Conductors and station masters shared information about successful escapes as a way of refining their methods and understanding what worked. Elias's escape was studied for lessons: his use of the creek to hide his scent, his movement during daylight hours when searchers expected him to hide, his ability to survive in the wilderness without supplies. These practical details were valuable to others planning escapes or helping escapees, but the story also served an emotional and psychological function, demonstrating that escape was possible even from deep in the South, even after a dramatic confrontation with a master. As the years passed and the Civil War approached, stories of slave resistance took on new urgency and meaning. Abolitionists in the North used such stories as evidence that enslaved people desired freedom and would fight for it if given the chance, countering pro-slavery arguments that claimed black people were content with their condition and unfit for freedom. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and other formerly enslaved people who became prominent abolitionists told their own stories of resistance and escape, adding their voices to a growing chorus that challenged the legitimacy of slavery and demanded its end. Elias's story was not among the most famous, did not achieve the widespread recognition of Tubman's repeated returns to the South to guide others to freedom or Douglass's eloquent speeches about his experiences in bondage. But it was part of the larger tapestry of resistance stories that helped shift public opinion in the North, that made slavery visible as a system of violence and oppression rather than the benevolent paternalism that slaveholders claimed. Every story of escape, every account of brutal punishment, every testimony about families torn apart contributed to the accumulating weight of evidence that slavery was a moral abomination that could not be reformed or justified. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, it was fought ostensibly over questions of states' rights and federal authority. But at its core, it was about slavery and whether the United States would continue to permit human bondage within its borders. The war transformed the lives of millions of enslaved people, creating opportunities for escape as Union armies advanced through Confederate territory. Many enslaved people fled to Union lines where they were initially termed contraband of war and later recognized as free people. Others remained on plantations but resisted more openly, knowing that the power of their masters was being challenged by military force. Elias Brown did not live to see the end of slavery. He died in 1867, just 2 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. He spent his final years in Ohio, working when his health permitted and struggling with poverty and disability when it did not. The community of formerly enslaved people where he lived took care of him in his final illness, sharing what little they had, sitting with him as his strength failed. He died quietly on a cold January morning, his body finally giving out after years of carrying the weight of trauma and hardship. Those who knew him in Ohio said he rarely spoke about his past. He did not tell stories about the night of the storm, did not boast about his escape, did not present himself as a hero or even as someone who had done anything particularly remarkable. He was a private man, quiet and withdrawn, and if he carried pride about his actions, he kept it to himself. Perhaps the memories were too painful to revisit, or perhaps he understood that true courage does not require an audience. He had done what he needed to do to survive, to claim his freedom, to refuse the life that others tried to impose on him, and that was enough. His grave in Ohio was forgotten after a generation. The wooden cross that marked it rotted away, and the exact location of his burial was lost as the cemetery fell into disrepair and was eventually paved over for development in the early 20th century. There is no physical monument to Elias Brown, no marker that says here lies a man who refused to be enslaved, who risked everything for freedom, who survived against impossible odds. His bones rest somewhere beneath concrete and asphalt in a Midwestern city, anonymous and unmarked, like so many others who lived and died in the margins of American history. But the story survived, even though the grave did not. In Alabama, in the communities descended from those who had been enslaved at Hightower Fields and other plantations in Wilcox County, the story of Elias Brown remained part of family histories and local folklore. Grandparents told it to grandchildren, teachers included it in informal histories, and when historians came asking questions in the 20th century, people remembered, even if the details had been blurred by time and retelling. The core of the story remained. A man named Elias had worked with horses, had been beaten by his master, had on one stormy night unleashed those horses in a way that led to his master's death, and had vanished into the night never to be captured. In the 21st century, historians and genealogists have worked to reconstruct the stories of enslaved people whose lives were poorly documented or deliberately obscured. They comb through plantation records, court documents, newspaper archives, and other sources, trying to piece together the lived experiences of people who left few written traces. In the case of Elias Brown, the documentary evidence is sparse. A few references in county records, mentions in the oral histories collected during the Federal Writers Project, fragments of stories preserved in family traditions. From these fragments, researchers have constructed what they can, acknowledging the gaps and uncertainties while recognizing the significance of what can be known. Some descendants of enslaved people from Hightower Fields still live in Alabama, and some of them claim connection to Elias Brown, though the genealogical records are too incomplete to verify these claims with certainty. What matters more than biological descent is cultural descent, the way his story has been claimed and preserved by communities that see in it a reflection of their own histories of resistance and survival. They honor Elias not as a perfect hero, but as a complicated human being who lived through impossible circumstances and made choices that ensured his survival and freedom, even though those choices came at a cost. The cost was not just to Elias himself, though he paid dearly in physical suffering and psychological trauma. The cost was also borne by those he left behind on the plantation, because masters often punished entire enslaved communities for the actions of individuals. After Elias's escape, William Hightower, who inherited the plantation, imposed stricter controls and harsher punishments. The people who had been Elias's friends and neighbors suffered for his actions, even though they had not participated in them and in many cases had not even known about his plans. This was the cruel arithmetic of slavery. Resistance by individuals often led to collective punishment, creating divisions within enslaved communities and making people wary of those who might bring down retribution on everyone. Yet despite this cost, communities of enslaved people continued to harbor and support those who attempted escape. They understood the mathematics of oppression, knew that submission did not guarantee safety, recognized that the system would find reasons to punish them regardless of their behavior. So they helped when they could, looked the other way when they needed to, preserved stories of successful escapes as treasured knowledge. The Underground Railroad depended on this collective support, on thousands of small acts of courage by people who risked their own safety to help others reach freedom. The story of Elias Brown raises difficult questions that have no easy answers. Was he justified in causing or facilitating Charles Hightower's death? In a system where enslaved people had no legal recourse, no protection from violence, no recognition of their basic humanity, what forms of resistance were legitimate? Modern discussions of these questions often divide along predictable lines, with some arguing that violence in response to slavery was entirely justified given the extreme violence of the system itself, while others maintain that taking human life is wrong regardless of circumstances and that Elias could have chosen escape without causing Hightower's death. But these arguments often miss the complexity of the actual situation. Elias did not have the luxury of time for moral deliberation. He had been beaten nearly to death, was in constant danger of being killed or sold away, and had to make a decision in a moment of crisis about how to respond. He chose survival, chose freedom, and used the tools available to him. His knowledge of horses and the opportunity provided by the storm to create a situation that would allow him to escape. Whether he intended Hightower's death or simply took advantage of an accident that resulted from the stampede, he made a choice to prioritize his own life and freedom over his master's safety. And in the moral universe of slavery, that choice was radical and dangerous. The question of violence and resistance to oppression has been debated throughout history, from the slave rebellions of ancient Rome to the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. Those who hold power invariably characterize resistance as criminal or terrorist violence, while those seeking liberation see it as justified response to systematic oppression. The story of Elias Brown fits into this larger pattern, a reminder that freedom has often been won through struggle, that oppressed people have always had to make difficult choices about how to resist systems designed to crush them, and that history's judgment of those choices depends greatly on who is telling the story. What cannot be disputed is that Elias Brown lived in a system that denied him every basic human right, that treated him as property rather than as a person, that subjected him to violence and exploitation without recourse or mercy. He spent his childhood and adolescence and early adulthood in bondage, never knowing a day of freedom, never having the opportunity to make choices about his own life, always subject to the whims and cruelties of those who claimed ownership of his body and his labor. The fact that he found a way to escape that system, to claim freedom for himself even at great cost and risk, is itself remarkable, regardless of the specific circumstances of Charles Hightower's death. The horses themselves become symbolic in the story, creatures that occupied a space between freedom and captivity, valued by their owner but also capable of wild, uncontrolled movement. Elias's deep connection with the horses, his ability to understand and work with them, gave him knowledge that he ultimately used to engineer his escape. In some ways, the horses represented a kind of natural force that could not be completely controlled, and by unleashing them, Elias aligned himself with that force, becoming something wild and uncontrolled himself, refusing the domestication that slavery required. The image of Elias standing in the stable doorway, rain pouring down, watching the horses stampede toward the master's house, has a kind of archetypal power. It represents a moment of transformation when someone who has been forced into passivity suddenly takes action, when someone who has been treated as less than human asserts their full humanity through decisive choice. Whether that image represents historical fact or has been embellished by generations of retelling, it captures something essential about resistance to oppression. The moment when fear is overcome, when the risk of action becomes preferable to the certainty of continued suffering, when someone decides that they would rather die free than live enslaved. The storm, too, carries symbolic weight in the story. Storms in African American spiritual tradition often represent both danger and divine intervention, moments when the natural order is disrupted and anything becomes possible. The fact that Elias made his move during a storm suggests both practical calculation, using the weather to cover his escape and to agitate the horses, and a deeper sense that this was a moment of cosmic significance when the usual rules no longer applied. The thunder and lightning, the wind and rain created conditions where the impossible became possible, where a man with no power could overthrow a man with total power, where justice could be delivered through the trampling hooves of horses driven wild by fear. In the decades after the Civil War, during the period known as Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people worked to build new lives in freedom. They established communities, created institutions, fought for political rights, and struggled to survive in an economy that still sought to exploit their labor through sharecropping and other systems of debt peonage. Stories like that of Elias Brown served as reminders of the courage that had brought them through slavery, as sources of pride and identity in the face of ongoing discrimination and violence. The story said, "We are descended from people who fought for their freedom, who refused to accept injustice, who survived impossible circumstances. We carry that strength in ourselves." As Jim Crow laws imposed new forms of oppression in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as lynchings and racial terror sought to maintain white supremacy through violence, stories of resistance became even more important. They provided historical context for ongoing struggles, demonstrated that resistance had a long history in Black communities, and offered models for how to maintain dignity and courage in the face of systematic oppression. The story of Elias Brown was one of many such stories, part of a tradition of remembering and honoring those who had refused to submit. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s drew on this tradition of resistance, connecting the sit-ins and freedom rides and voter registration drives to a longer history of Black struggle for justice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, though they differed in tactics and philosophy, both acknowledged the importance of understanding history, of recognizing that the movement for equality did not begin with them but extended back through generations of people who had fought in their own ways against slavery, segregation, and discrimination. Stories like Elias Brown's were part of the historical foundation on which the civil rights movement built, evidence that the desire for freedom was not new, that Black people had always resisted their oppression, that the struggle for justice had deep roots. In our own time, as America continues to grapple with the legacy of slavery and ongoing racial inequality, stories like that of Elias Brown remain relevant. They remind us that history is not just about laws and presidents and battles, but about individual human beings making choices in impossible circumstances, about people whose names have been largely forgotten but whose actions mattered. They challenge us to think about the long reach of historical injustice, about how the trauma of slavery continues to echo through generations, about what we owe to those who suffered and resisted and survived. The story also raises questions about historical memory and whose stories get preserved and how. Elias Brown's story survived primarily through oral tradition, through the determination of Black communities to remember and honor their ancestors even when the official historical record ignored or marginalized them. This pattern of preservation outside official channels is itself significant, a form of resistance against the historical amnesia that would erase the experiences and contributions of Black people from the American narrative. The work of preserving these stories, of passing them down through generations, of eventually getting them recorded in books and archives, is part of the ongoing struggle for recognition and justice. Today, there are efforts to mark sites of historical significance related to slavery, to create museums and monuments that acknowledge this dark chapter of American history, to educate new generations about what actually happened and how it shaped the world we live in. These efforts are often controversial, as debates over Confederate monuments and critical race theory in schools demonstrate. Some people want to move past history to focus on the present and future rather than dwelling on the past. But others argue that we cannot move forward without understanding where we have been, that acknowledging historical injustice is necessary for creating a more just society, that the stories of people like Elias Brown deserve to be told and remembered. In Wilcox County, Alabama, where Hightower Fields once stood, there is now a historical marker erected by the County Historical Society that mentions the plantation and its role in the cotton economy. The marker does not mention Elias Brown or the circumstances of Charles Hightower's death, does not acknowledge the stories that have been passed down through black families in the area. This absence is typical of historical markers throughout the South, which often present sanitized versions of history that minimize the violence and oppression of slavery, and focus instead on economic development and prominent white families. But there are growing calls to revise these markers, to include the perspectives and experiences of enslaved people, to tell a more complete and honest history. Some local residents, both black and white, have proposed creating a memorial to enslaved people at the site where Hightower Fields once stood. The memorial would include the names of those who are documented as having been enslaved there, including Elias Brown, and would tell the story of their lives and labor. The proposal has met with mixed reactions, with some seeing it as an important step toward historical truth and reconciliation, while others argue it would be divisive, or that focusing on slavery is unnecessarily negative. These debates reflect larger tensions in American society about how to remember and reckon with the past, about whether confronting historical injustice is healing or harmful, about whose stories matter and deserve to be told. For descendants of enslaved people, these questions have clear answers. Their stories matter, their ancestors' suffering and resistance deserve recognition, and the truth about slavery needs to be told fully and honestly, not hidden or minimized for the comfort of those who would prefer not to think about it. The story of Elias Brown, whether historically documented in detail or preserved primarily through oral tradition, is their story, part of their heritage and identity, a source of pride and connection to ancestors who endured unimaginable hardship and found ways to survive and resist. As the story of Elias Brown demonstrates, the history of slavery is not just about oppression but also about resistance, not just about victimization but also about agency, not just about suffering but also about survival and the refusal to be broken. These stories complicate simplistic narratives that present enslaved people as passive victims waiting to be freed by others. Instead, they show people who actively sought their own freedom, who made difficult and dangerous choices, who used whatever tools and knowledge they had available to resist the system that sought to control them completely. The story ends, as it must, with Elias Brown's death in Ohio in 1867, his body worn out at age 38, his grave lost to time and development. But endings are also beginnings in the story that survived him, the legend of the slave who unleashed the horses and vanished into the stormy night beyond the fields, continues to live in the memories and imaginations of those who hear it. It lives in family stories told around dinner tables, in history books written by scholars working to recover erased narratives, and conversations about resistance and freedom and what we owe to our ancestors. The horses that Elias unleashed that night were eventually recaptured, brought back to the stable, put back to work. But something had changed. Some boundary had been crossed, some demonstration had been made that the system was not as secure as it claimed to be. And Elias himself, whether he lived his remaining years in peace or in poverty or in some combination of both, had claimed something that no one could take from him. He had chosen freedom, had acted on his own behalf, had refused the identity that slavery tried to impose on him. In a world that denied his humanity, he had asserted it absolutely. In a system designed to crush his will, He had acted according to his own determination. In bondage, he had found a way to be free. That is the story that survives, the story that matters, the story worth telling and retelling. It is a story about courage and resistance, about the human refusal to accept injustice as inevitable, about the long struggle for freedom that continues in every generation. It is a story about horses and storms and violence and escape, but it is also a story about dignity and determination and the unbreakable human spirit. It is the story of Elias Brown, enslaved in Alabama, who on one stormy night in 1853 opened the stable doors and set something in motion that could not be stopped, who vanished into the darkness and lived to see freedom, however briefly, however hard, won. And perhaps on certain stormy nights in Wilcox County when lightning splits the sky and thunder rolls across the old cotton fields that have been transformed by time and mechanization into something unrecognizable from what they once were. Perhaps there is still an echo of hoofbeats, still a shadow of a lone rider on a gray horse, still the ghost of Elias Brown riding free beneath the storm clouds, never stopping, never captured, still running toward whatever lies beyond the reach of those who would claim ownership of human souls.